All right, we are live and ready to go. And we are also live on our YouTube channel, Church Love 333. Welcome, welcome, welcome to those of you who are joining us. And I'm just taking a moment to invite some people who say they have not been getting the notifications through Facebook. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are on day 9 of this book talk, and we are talking from White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. Tim Wise covers things like white supremacy, white privilege, and today he is talking from his own experiences. This book is part research and part memoir. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is where we are. If you'd like to go back to any of the previous readings, you can click on the hashtag reflections on race and it will take you to the previous readings from this book. We are starting today with Tim Wise, and he's discussing his journey through school. And we really actually have been hitting a lot about disparities in the public school system, of which he was a part of. I've shared some of my own experiences, both as an educator and as a student. And today he is talking from the subject of being a Jew, because he is a European Jew. And he's talking from that perspective of what it means to be a European Jew in America and how whiteness plays into that. And so he's starting again with his childhood, and he's taking us through his experiences, you know, going to temple and going to school and that kind of thing. So that is where we are today, just to kind of give you a frame of reference for what we are reading. And I do believe that we are going to, let's see. We're also going to get into his experience with debate. And we are going to stop there. So we've got a pretty good section to read today. And I hope that everybody is doing well, just giving a moment for people to come in. We are also, again, broadcasting live through my YouTube channel, Church Love 333. So if anything happens to Facebook Live, you can go to YouTube and check us out on that channel as well. And we're going to get started in just one moment. If you're here and you can see clearly and nothing is breaking up for you and everything is working well, including sound, if you will put a thumbs up for me. So if you can see and hear clearly and your screen is not breaking up, you can put a thumbs up and we'll get ready to begin. Awesome. White Like Me by Tim White. Interestingly, my identity as a Jew had never really been something about which I thought of until more. Around about that time, in addition to institutionalized Christianity that coursed through my school, there was also the day in May 1981 when a group of neo-Nazis and Klan members were arrested as they drove onto the grounds of the temple with what they thought was a working bomb. They had intended to detonate it and blow up my house of worship in the process, only to discover that the device was a fake, planted by one of their number who was an FBI informant. Good times. I was growing up in a mixed faith home in which my mom was a Christian and my dad, though Jewish, was largely uninvolved in my religious upbringing. I would be sent off to temple each Sunday or Saturday beginning in the 8th grade, where the rabbi would teach me what it meant to be Jewish. And if not the rabbi, surely one of the several classroom teachers in the Hebrew school could accomplish it. But I guess I wasn't a very good student because I never learned much. I learned vaguely about Jewish perspectives in various school issues of the day, but it seemed as though most of the lessons were about victimization, the Holocaust of European Jewry, or mistreatment at the hands of the Egyptian pharaohs. Besides that, I can't recall much except being constantly hit up for tzedakah money by the school director so as to help plant trees in Israel. Tzedakah is a Hebrew word often translated as charity, though actually it's meant to refer to justice. It's somewhat similar to tithing by Christians, although I've never heard of Catholic churches guilt-tripping 8-year-olds into coughing up a percentage of their allowance so as to plant trees in Vatican City. Not to mention, since those trees were likely to be planted on land taken from the Palestinians, whether in 1948 or 1967. Tzedakah money for such a purpose would likely run directly counter to the cause of justice. But as a kid, I would have known nothing of that. I also remember being berated and bullied by the Hebrew teacher who was fresh from her last job with the Israeli Defense Force. I simply could not learn the language, nor did I understand the importance of doing so. Even then, it struck me as odd that the Jews would be trying to recapture the language of the Torah for everyday use, as in Israel, when frankly, Yiddish had served most of our ancestors just fine for centuries, and before that, Aramaic, following the Babylonian exile. Later, of course, I would learn that to many in the Zionist movement, Yiddish was a shameful peasant language associated with the diaspora, so it was to be spurned in favor of the language of King David. If we reclaim the ancient language, we could reclaim the ancient greatness, the ancient power never to be oppressed again, or so the story went. The modern Hebrew movement was, in a real sense, born of a deep shame at having been so mightily oppressed throughout Christian Europe and exiled from our ancient homeland. At some level, the reclaiming of Hebrew and the post-Shoah cry of never again both seem as much internally directed self-affirmations as outwardly pointed warnings to the rest of the world. I got along virtually with no one at Temple. Most of the kids there went to private school, and their dads were doctors or attorneys or professors or businessmen. Most all of their parents had college degrees. And while I played ball at the Y with my black friends, they played at the Jewish Community Center surrounded by other Jews. It seemed a very cloistered environment and very clubby, and I couldn't stand it. The few kids there I went to school with were okay, but I wasn't really close to any of them. It took me years to figure out why I'd been so miserable at Temple and why I never felt as though I fit in. Though I wouldn't have known it at the time, nor even the meaning of the word to describe the problem, in retrospect, I can see that it was principally the classism of it all. While there are far more working class and even poor Jews in the United States than most people realize, estimates place the latter number at around 15%, or about 1 in 7 American Jews. In places like Nashville, lower income Jews are almost completely invisible. While working class Jewish communities and neighborhoods are common in larger cities like New York, in places with much smaller Jewish communities, economically marginal Jews are pretty much out of sight and out of mind. They can't afford the cost of temple or synagogue, or even if they can, they can't swing the additional expense of participating in the civic events put together by the Jewish Federation. So, absent the financial resources to make themselves people worth knowing, they are effectively excluded from Jewish life. As one of the few Jews at Temple in those days from a lower income, non-professional family, I struggled constantly with the nature of my Jewishness, as I think my father did. I'm certain that the reason he rarely ever set foot in the temple, typically coming only for services on high holy days, was that compared to all these other families, ours seemed a relative failure. The internalized oppression, a concept about which I would learn many years later as it relates to people of color victimized by racism, was in this instance finding a home in me as well. It was bad enough to be economically struggling when you were white and expected to succeed, but to be white and Jewish and still be struggling was a double whammy. What was wrong with us and with me? Much like the Asian kid who isn't good at math or science and thereby finds himself or herself coming up short in relation to the Asian archetype constructed largely by non-Asians, so too was I seeming to fail in relation to the archetype of acceptable Jewishness, good with money, successful, hardworking. To be the broke Jew was to grapple with self-doubt as a matter of a weekly routine. It was to fail to fit in within your community, even as the other community, the Gentile community, was reminding you in any number of ways that you weren't one of theirs either. My Jewishness wobbly at best, I would more or less abandon it in any formal sense after my freshman year of high school, right after Rabbi Falk, who had been something of a civil rights legend in Nashville, threatened to fail me in Hebrew school if I didn't attend at least 7 Friday night services per school semester. Though I tried to explain to him that I couldn't attend that many Friday services, weekends were when I went out of town for debate tournaments, and debate was going to be my way into college. Not being a Jew, he persisted in his threats. Having been taught not to sit idly by and suffer fools gladly, nor the petty injustices often meted out by said fools, I did the most Jewish thing I could think to do in that situation. I staged a walkout, telling him I was done with him and Temple, roughly in that order. So, again, Tim White he begins to detail why he winds up not buying into his faith or not buying into his community because of classism and how he felt left out of that environment because he didn't feel like he fit in. And so one of the things he talks about throughout his writing is this notion of classism, of the wealthy and the poor, of the fact that you can be a part of a community and still feel left out of it because of the class divide, right? Because of the wealth divide. So here we see he winds up basically being a Jew more by culture than by faith. So now he's actually going to go into talking about dealing with high school, and he's also going to talk about his ticket, what he calls his ticket into college, which is debate. I couldn't wait for the first day of high school to be done with John Trotwood Moore. Would make Hillsborough seem like heaven, and no matter how much more inviting it actually proved to be. Yes, as a freshman, I'd be on the bottom rung of the ladder, but I didn't care. There would be new people to meet, new activities in which to get involved, and since it had been the school to which both my parents had gone and which my dad had graduated from, I felt like I belonged there. It was almost as if I could claim some ownership over the space, if only because a mere 17 or 18 years earlier, my mom and dad had walked those halls and some of their old teachers were still there. Hillsborough was a comprehensive high school, which is just fancy talk for a school that viciously tracks its students, some into the college prep track and others into a vocational track. I'll leave it up to the reader's imagination to guess the racial and class demographic of each in turn. Of course, the teachers there, as with most places, would deny to the death that there was anything the least bit racist about this arrangement or their own disparate treatment of the students. Rather, they would have said, as teachers most everywhere do, that they treat all kids the same and don't see color. Now, we talked in day 8, we talked in day 7 and day 8, we talked a little bit about this process of academic tracking and how it is and it has been proven to be racially motivated, that many students of color, Latino, Black, have been tracked into these vocational tracks to where by the time they get to 12th grade, they don't even have the coursework that they need in order to get into a 4-year college, even if they decided to get into or that they wanted to go to a 4-year college, because they have not taken the prerequisite classes in high school. So one of the things he's talking about is this issue of academic tracking. And on that broadcast, I believe it was day 7, I put down links to all of the different research and studies that have been done that have shown where this process comes from and how it's creating disparities in schools that should not be there. The other thing he talks about here is he talks about the college prep track and the vocational track. And then he also talks about the treatment of teachers towards students. Now, even here in 2016, I've seen at least 2 or 3 articles just at the beginning of this week where teachers are being reprimanded, suspended from their jobs because of some of the things that they're saying to students that they have no business saying or that they have no business doing. And so, again, you still have educators who probably should not be in an educational setting because you are affecting the lives of children, foisting their prejudices and bigotry off on students. So this is still going on in 2016. I do share in another video, I do share about my own experiences in school and what happened and how that affected the track that I would go on in terms of college and middle school, from middle school to high school to college. And so he's pointing out here that, yeah, there's teachers out there that are not always genuine about their agenda as they're teaching students. And he's telling the truth. Here he says, putting aside the absurdity of the claim, studies indicate that we tend to make very fine distinctions based on color and that we notice color differences almost immediately. The fact is, color blindness is not the proper goal of fair-minded educators. The kids in those classrooms do have a race, and it matters because it says a lot about the kinds of challenges they are likely to face. Now, we discussed earlier in one of our other broadcasts that race is a social construct. But because it is a social construct, it does have consequences in the way that people in our society are treated. To not see color is, as Julian Bond has noted, to not see the consequences of color. And if color has consequences, yet you've resolved not to notice the things that brings these consequences, the odds are pretty good that you'll fail to serve the needs of the students in question. To not see people for who they are is to miss that some, but not all students are dealing with racism. It is to privilege the norm, which is white, by assuming that kids are kids and then treating the kids the way you treat your own. But with more than 8 in 10 teachers in the United States being white, the children in the care of teachers for 8 hours a day often look very different from the kids to whom these teachers go home at night. To treat everyone the same is to miss the fact that children of color have all the same challenges that white kids do, and then that one extra thing that they're dealing with, racism. But if you've told yourself you're not to see race, you'll be unlikely to notice discrimination based on it, let alone know how to respond to it. The consequences of artificial color blindness would become apparent at Hillsborough a few years later in my senior year when we had a small-scale race riot involving about 3 dozen students, not white against black, but white and black on one side against Southeast Asian students on the other, most of whom had come to America after 1975 in the wake of the Vietnam War. Had you asked teachers or the administration if there were racial problems at this school at the beginning of the year, they would have assured you there were not. They would have pointed to the generally positive relationships between people of different races and downplayed or ignored the extreme isolation of the Southeast Asian students, much to the detriment of the institution, as we would later learn when we had to have cops in the hallways for 3 days just to restore calm. Having never been asked to think about how we view the newcomers among us, often quite negatively, or to consider how misunderstandings often flared because of language and cultural barriers, the school shut its eyes and pretended everything was fine. By stifling any discussion of racial and cultural bias, and certainly never expecting the rest of us to learn about Thai, Lao, Vietnamese, and Hmong cultures and interrogate our prejudices, Hillsborough's color blindness created the conditions that gave rise to the riot. Good morning to those of you who are coming in and watching and reading and listening along with us. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let's back up. So again, he's again talking about this issue with racism and bigotry, and how it doesn't just necessarily run black and white, as what happened with his school, because his school chose to ignore what was happening between the students. And as he said, the school never really did question the students on how they felt about these kids from other cultures, Southeast Asian, coming into their school. So because they chose to ignore what was happening, they chose to ignore the prejudices that were brewing, it caused a race riot in their school, where they had to have cops come in for 3 days just to restore order in the school. And he's saying largely because the school was acting as if there was no issue. And, you know, we can't enumerate how many times that happens, or that can happen, especially in a public school setting, that leads to the police having to come and restore order in the school. Well, now they have the school resource officers. So there's usually an officer already on campus now in many places. Although I still love theater, I didn't really want to do plays in high school. That had been my father's thing at Hillsborough. So there were any number of reasons why I figured I'd better go in a different direction. Instead of getting involved with the drama club, I chose forensics. When someone first mentioned it to me, I had no idea what they were talking about. The only time I'd heard that word was with regard to forensic science as part of the introduction to a TV show which my mom and I loved to watch. Not wanting to cut up cadavers or investigate crime scenes, I had said no thanks. Once I learned that this kind of forensics referred to speech competitions, I decided to take a look. Though I would ultimately settle on debate as my principal activity, I hadn't thought that would be the case at first. Rather, Albert, my friend, and I began doing Inherit the Wind as a dramatic interpretation piece at local forensics competitions, winning several and placing at others. Although I had also been signed up at my first forensics tournament to do extemporaneous speaking, which involved drawing a topic from a hat and then having 30 minutes to put together a 6-minute speech on whatever subject you've drawn, I found the prospect terrifying. After drawing my topic, I totally freaked out, leaving the library after 10 minutes of preparation and walking around the building until well past my time to make my presentation. Thankfully, my coach made me go back in for the second and third rounds, and I've been speaking ever since. Debate would become for me in high school what theater had been in middle school, a place to put my energy and also an escape from the craziness that was my home life. The idea of throwing myself into an activity that allowed me to travel, to get away from home at least 2 weekends a month, was more than a little appealing. I was sure by now that my father was not going to kill my mother, so I didn't fear leaving them alone, and mostly I just needed a break from the fighting and the drinking. There have always been debaters of color, and indeed my high school's top debater when I arrived was a black senior, James Bernard. James, who would attend Harvard Law with Barack Obama several years later, and would be one of the founders and publishers of the hip-hop magazine, The Source, taught me a lot about debate as well as activism, the latter in his capacity as one of the key players in the Nashville Youth Network, a loosely knit coalition of teens energized around a number of issues of relevance to young people at the time. But despite James' debate prowess, the activity was and still is extraordinarily white. not merely in terms of its demographic, but also in terms of the style, the form, and the content at the most competitive levels. Debate literally exudes whiteness and privileges white participants in a number of ways. On the one hand, there is the issue of money. Debaters, in order to be nationally competitive, require funding. Either a school with a huge budget to pay for trips to national tournaments, or families that can swing the cost of sending their kids away for 3 days at a time, often by plane, for the purpose of competing. I had neither, but between what minor help my parents could offer and the money I made working 20 hours a week sacking groceries at a local market, we managed to make it work. Then there are the summer debate camps, which even in the 1980s cost about $1,500, which run for 3 to 4 weeks. Those who can afford to go to these get a huge jump on the competition. In fact, I don't know of any nationally competitive team whose members didn't at least attend one camp during the summer. During the summer before my junior year, my family was unable to afford to send me to a debate institute, and being unable to go set me back considerably in terms of my skills for several months at the beginning of the tournament season. It took me most of the first semester to catch up to the other national circuit debaters who had been at camps learning technique and the year's topic backwards and forward, all with the assistance of college coaches and top-notch research facilities. I want to stop real quickly there and say this. In today's society, almost every extracurricular activity now, even with his being a part of his high school curriculum, but literally almost every activity requires a degree of money. So as he was saying here, one of the ways that this particular thing, right, is a part of privilege is because it requires a lot of money to participate in. Now, I have lots of friends who are parents, and I can't even imagine how they are affording everything from cheerleader camp to football camp to, in his case, the debate tournament, the competitions, the coaching, all of the different camps that happen, right? Because in those camps, as he's pointing out here, those kids are getting an advantage, or they're getting an upper hand, or they're getting the ability to sharpen their skills. And so one of the ways that he's talking about that separates people, right, is the notion of class, or the notion of money. I know for me, dealing in the arts as a fine artist, as a visual artist, living in the hood, and my mom and my relatives trying to pool together money to get me my art supplies. Forget the camps. just the cost of my art supplies alone to be able to put out quality work was costing an arm and a leg. Like literally, it was like a family, let's go around, let's pass the collection plate and see who can help get this girl some art supplies. Because, Crayola is good, but I needed more than Crayola to do some of my work, right? Or in my particular setting for fine arts, my teachers would ask us to get specific brands, which were, 2 or 3 times the cost of some of the other basic art materials brands. So he is actually making a really good point here that you gotta pay to play. You might want to be in this debate arena, but as he's pointing out here, if it wasn't for his parents having money, and if it wasn't for him as a high school student working, which I also did as well, working and earning your own money so that you can participate in certain things, even with sports, right? There's sports camps, there's materials, there's uniform costs. So it's not just this thing of, oh, well, if your kid is talented, right? Or if they have the skill, then they have a chance. They have to have skill, and many times they have to be able to meet the costs of what it takes to be a part of that particular thing. And God bless the parents that have 2 and 3 children, and one child may be wants to do baseball, another child may be doing softball, another child may be in cheerleading camp, another child may be in football camp. They've got to find a way, right, to support those things or support those activities that their children are involved in. So it does require money to do that. And that's one of the things that he's pointing out, that even if you are good at what you do, or even if you desire to be a part of something, oftentimes money and the amount of that things cost can be a hindrance and can be a barrier to getting into that environment. Let's keep reading. Obviously, given the interplay of race and socioeconomic status in this country, Blacks, Latinos, American Indians, and Southeast Asians, all of which groups have much higher poverty rates than whites, are woefully underrepresented in an activity relative to their numbers in the student population. But the cost of debate is hardly the only thing that causes the activity to be so white. The substance of the arguments made and the way in which the arguments are delivered also tend to appeal to whites far more readily than to people of color, for whom the style and substance are often too removed from the real world to be of much practical value. Those who haven't seen a competitive debate, particularly in the most dominant category known as policy debate, may be inclined to think that such a thing is a deep discussion of some pressing issue. But if that is what you expected, then you happened into a debate at one of the nation's top tournaments and watched any of the elimination rounds, those involving the top 16 or 32 teams, typically, you would think that you had walked into a world of make-believe. Even if you could understand a single word being said, which is unlikely, since the best debaters typically speak at lightning speed, and I was among the biggest offenders here, able to rattle off 500 words a minute, you still wouldn't really understand what was going on. The terminology is arcane and only of use in the activity itself, like topicality, terms like counterplan, permutation, infinite regression, and critic. The purpose of competitive debate is essentially to speak faster than your opponents so they will drop one of your arguments, which you will then insist to the judge is the most important issue in the round, warranting an immediate ballot in your favor. Just as critical, debaters are to make sure that whatever the topic, their arguments for or against a particular policy must be linked to nuclear war or ecological catastrophe, no matter how absurd the link is. So, for example, you might claim that your opponent's plan to extend the retirement age will contribute to global warming by keeping people in the workforce longer, thereby increasing consumption levels, thereby increasing energy expenditure, thereby speeding up climate change and the ultimate end of the world. Though one can theoretically learn quite a bit from debate, especially during the research phase, the fact remains that superficiality, speed, and mass extinction scenarios typically take the place of these policy analyses. My own debate experience serves as vulgar confirmation of this maxim that debaters will say virtually anything. On the one hand, I ran cases in which we called for cutting off of weapons sales to Venezuela and also for the restoration of voting rights to ex-felons, positions with which I agreed. On the other hand, I also ran cases calling for a program that would employ all poor folks who were out of work to build a missile defense system, although it was against what I believe. Although the idea of protecting soft targets from terrorism might make sense, the evidence we used to make our case was almost exclusively from disgusting anti-Muslim sources. I am still taking extra baths to wash off from the stench of having read evidence in debate rounds from people who would later criticize me in life on my websites. So I guess the feeling is mutual. When we were on the negative side, I would argue, among other things, that poverty should be allowed to continue because it would eventually trigger a glorious socialist revolution, or that civil liberties should be eradicated so that the United States could transition to a society in which resource use was limited by force, family size was strictly controlled, and planetary destruction averted. These kinds of arguments, it should be noted, were hardly mine alone. They were absolutely typical on the national debate circuit, and they still are. The reason I call this process a white one is because whites, and especially affluent ones, much more so than folks of color, have the luxury of looking at life or death issues of war, peace, famine, unemployment, or criminal justice as simply a game, as a mere exercise in intellectual and rhetorical debate and banter. For me to get up and debate, for example, whether or not full employment is a good idea, presupposes that my people, my folks, are not likely to be out of work as I go about this task. To debate whether racial profiling is legitimate likewise presupposes that I, the debater, am not likely to be someone who was confronted by the practice as my team drove to the tournament that day, or as we passed through security at the airport. In this way, competitive debate reinforces whiteness and affluence as normative conditions and makes the process more attractive to affluent white students. Kids of color and working class youth of all colors are simply not as likely to gravitate to an activity where pretty much half of the time they're going to be forced to take positions that, if implemented in the real world, might actually devastate themselves or their communities. Because debaters are encouraged to think about life or death matters as if they had little consequence beyond a given debate round, the fact that those who have come through the activity go on to hold a disproportionate share of political power and legal positions is something about which the National Forensics League has long bragged. This is a matter that should concern us all. These kids are being primed to think of serious issues as abstractions, and that increases the risk that the person who has been primed will reduce everything to a brutal cost-benefit analysis, which rarely prioritizes the needs and interests of the society's less powerful. Mind you, these are the students that go on to hold powerful political and legal positions in our society. It becomes easier at that point to support policies that benefit the haves at the expense of the have-nots, because others whom ex-debaters have never met and never had to take seriously will be the ones who feel the damage of their policies. So one of the things that he's pointing out that he learned through this debate class and debate process is that if you're debating these topics that are real world topics for people of color, as he points out, what's happening is you're being trained or you're being desensitized to only think of these real world topics that are happening to people in real time. You're being desensitized only to think of them in terms of cost and benefit. So one of the things he's pointing out here is these debaters usually are the students that go on to hold political positions in our society and legal positions in our society. So if they are being trained to, as he says, they're being primed to reduce everything in society to a cost and benefit analysis. They're being trained to take out the humanity piece of analysis. So they're not being trained to think about this in terms of humanity. They're being trained to think about major issues in terms of what's the cost, and what's the benefit? To them, by the way. What's the cost and what's the benefit? And if there's no benefit, then would I have a problem, right, with getting rid of something that would benefit the poor, even though it doesn't benefit me? So he's saying that, this whole process of debate desensitizes people to the humanity of others, because you're only arguing subject matter from a very sterilized position that's not taking into account humanity. Unless debate is fundamentally transformed, and at this point, the only forces for real change are the squads from urban debate leagues and a few college squads of color, we are clamoring for different styles of argumentation and different standards. It will continue to serve as a staging ground for those whose interests are mostly the interests of the powerful. Until the voices of economically and racially marginalized persons are given equal weight in debate rounds with those of affluent white experts whose expertise is only presumed because other whites published what they had to say in the first place, the ideas that shape our world will continue to be those of the elite, no matter how destructive these ideas have proven to be for the vast majority of the planet's inhabitants. Privilege makes its recipients oblivious to certain things, and debate as an activity is one of its many transition belts, one that I was able to access to great effect in my life. Lucky for me that I went to a school that offered it, that I had parents who somehow managed to help me afford it, and that its game-playing format wasn't yet a problem for me, ethically speaking. Lucky for me, in other words, that I was white. Debate wasn't the only arena for white privilege in high school. There was also the entirely Eurocentric curricula, the ability to get away with cheating or even skipping school in ways no student of color could likely have done. And of course, there was the partying. I can't even remember, because there were simply too many to recall, the number of parties I attended in high school at which hundreds of underage kids, including myself, were drinking and taking various types of drugs. These were parties with up to 5 kegs of beer, where guys were taking cover charges at the end of the driveway and stamping people's hands right on the road in plain view of everyone, including the police cars that would occasionally cruise by to make sure the noise wasn't getting too loud. On more than a few occasions, the cops would even come onto the property in response to a noise complaint and tell us to cut the music down. There's simply no chance that the officers didn't know alcohol was being served. Likewise, they had to have been able to detect the smell of marijuana in the air. Yet, not once did they arrest anyone or even tell us to get rid of the booze and the weed, so as to warn us that next time we wouldn't be so lucky. Instead, next time we would be that lucky, and the next time, and the next time, and after that. Those parties were at the homes of white people, surrounded by other homes lived in by white people, and attended almost exclusively by white people. There would always be a few people of color around, but for the most part, these were white spaces, which immediately gave law enforcement officials reason to cut us slack. Had these house parties been in black neighborhoods, they would never have been allowed to go on at all, as large as they were, even without a single illegal substance on the premises. But for whites in white neighborhoods, everything was different. Our illegality was looked at with a wink and a nod. Criminal activity was also regularly overlooked on the debate circuit. When debaters at Nashville's prestigious boys' prep school, Montgomery Bell Academy, were caught destroying law journals at Vanderbilt University's law school by using razor blades to cut out important evidence rather than take time or spend the money to make Xerox copies, they faced no criminal penalties. Their parents probably prepaid Vanderbilt for the damage, or perhaps MBA paid the bill just to keep the activities of their elite team quiet. But whatever the case, no one ended up with a record, and MBA as an institution gave no collective punishment either. No grounding their teams from the competition that year. With the exception of those of us in the Nashville area who knew the debaters and considered some of them friends, most folks on the national circuit probably knew little of what had happened. Needless to say, if an urban team made up of Black or Latino kids went into the library of their local college and defaced private property, things would go a bit differently. When it came to drugs, the debate circuit was probably the best place to score. So everyone could identify the noise when the briefcase of one of the top debaters accidentally opened up in the auditorium at Emory University, spilling its contents in front of 500 students waiting to hear what teams had advanced to the eliminating rounds. Everyone knew what that noise signified, and no one did anything but laugh as the debaters scrambled to put the evidence of their recreational drug use away. That summer, I attended debate camp at American University in DC. Upon arriving, I checked in, put my bags on the floor next to my bed, and spent the next 2 hours in the room of arguably the best debater in the history of the activity, getting baked into oblivion. Everyone knew what was going on in the room, yet no one did a thing. Even if you couldn't smell the weed, you couldn't miss the aroma of burning cologne, entire bottles of it that had been poured out just inside the door and set on fire to cover up the real thing that was taking place. No 17-year-old kid wears that much polo. And then there was alcohol. When it came to drinking, I would venture to guess that pretty much every white student at my school who wanted a fake ID had one, many of them because of my own entrepreneurial efforts. I began my fake ID business out of my home, shuttling people in and out of my parents' apartment, with their knowledge, I should add, occasionally a dozen in one afternoon. The process was simple. You brought a pack of instant film along with $20. I would take an entire roll. However many seemed usable were yours to keep. Then you had only to apply a white sticker to the back of the otherwise black instant camera film so as to mimic the plain white backing on a real license. Tennessee didn't laminate licenses in those days, so all you had to do was pop your fake one into the little plastic holder that the state had provided for your real driver's license, and you were pretty much able to get into any club you wanted and to drink at most bars. I even showed my fake IDs to cops on 2 occasions, as did plenty other folks I knew, but we never got busted, even when I showed a phony Iowa license to a cop who was originally from Iowa and had to know the ID was phony since I had just made up the template off the top of my head. That was the same night that another of my friends showed the same cop an ID that was real, but which belonged to a guy who was in his late 20s or early 30s. Not even close did he look to the guy, but good enough for the white boys. It was also in high school that I began to develop my political sensibilities, aided in that process by the research I was doing for debate, but also influenced by punk music. Having spent several years listening to music hardly at all, by high school I had begun to gravitate to punk, in part because it spoke to the sense of personal alienation I felt, still ensconced as I was in my dysfunctional home situation, and also because it resonated with my growing politicization. Not all punk was political, to be sure, and even the punk that wasn't always progressive. Bands like Fear had deliberately offensive right-wing tilt to their lyrics. And the Ramones, who I loved, were an amalgam of 2 warring political factions, one led by Joey, the New York Jewish liberal, and the other by Johnny, the far-right military brat, who stole Joey's girlfriend. That said, most punk acts leaned pretty clearly to the left, as if they had any discernible politics at all. It was through punk records that I first became aware of any number of burning issues at the time, especially those concerning the United States foreign and military policy. I was instantly riveted to the growing anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. The zine discussed, albeit briefly, the history of U.S. support for white racist government there, which, although representing only 6% of the population, oppressed the black majority viciously, including the Commerce Department approval of the sale of shock batons to the South African Defense Forces for use on Black prisoners. It was also then that I learned of the death of activist and apartheid foe Stephen Biko in police custody in 1977, which then led me to seek out his collected essays, I Write What I Like, which remains among the most influential books in my own political and anti-racist development. In fact, I like the title so much that I adopted it as a personal mantra of sorts, though obviously I had never faced, nor would I ever experience oppression, the likes of that which Biko had endured in the end. So Tim kind of jumps from talking about whiteness in debates to the fact that criminality or criminal activity was often overlooked on the debate circuit, to the fact that criminality in general, as he was saying, with things like fake IDs, drinking parties at schools, were often overlooked because it was happening in a predominantly white space. Of course, there are studies that are done on these things that he's talking about today. But if you ask most people will deny that white criminality is overlooked in youth. But we know that's not the case. So I appreciate the fact that Tim is detailing the fact that even though his peers, students his age, were doing the same kinds of illegal activities that other students may have been doing, because the space was predominantly white, they were given a pass. And not just, as he's pointing out here in the reading today, not just given a pass by officials, whether it was, the debate team guy whose drug paraphernalia spilled out during, them waiting on their competition results, and nobody said anything, and he just put all of the materials away. But he also points out the fact that law enforcement officers many times saw what was going on with these white teenagers, and they overlooked what they were doing and gave them a pass. So as we stop here for today, I want you to think about that he continues to express that, and as he goes into talking about how he got into activism and how he got into looking at what was happening in South Africa, which is what his community, his youth community, got involved in, trying to deal with apartheid in his day and age. Think about what he is saying here about the attitude towards criminality among white youth versus the attitude of criminality amongst Black teenagers. One of the things he mentions today is, the block parties that would occur, and the fact that, as long as it was happening in a predominantly white space, that police didn't necessarily stop their parties or, tell them to disperse or shut down their parties. They would come and they would say, turn down the music. And as he said, there were some parties where you could clearly notate that there was drugs happening or that kids were doing underage drinking, but yet the parties were allowed to go on. So think about that in terms of how would those scenarios be treated in an all-Black neighborhood, right? As he was saying, many of the times, and I know in my own neighborhood, if you had a block party going on and you started blocking the streets, or there were cars lined up, or there was a outside DJ, the cops were going to show up and they were going to eventually shut your party down. And I know, because I went to some of these block parties, and I didn't recall seeing anybody doing alcohol or using drugs. They were just out having a good time. Everybody was out in the streets, dancing, that was the main thing, you know, could you dance? But those parties were still shut down because they were in the hood. So you know, he gives you a couple of things to think about in today's reading. How are we looking at Black youth versus white youth? Are we saying, even somebody used this with one of the presidential candidates, are we saying boys will be boys, children will be children, or are we criminalizing them at an early age? How are we handling that? So that's where we're going to stop today. Tomorrow we will pick back up for day 10. I hope that he has said some things that will give you an opportunity to think about programs, think about extracurricular activities, and how do those extracurricular activities, how do they limit students from participating if they don't have the money to participate? Think about in your area, are there any leagues, sports leagues, dance leagues that are relatively affordable for kids to get involved in, for students to get involved in? Are there any leagues that are free for students to participate in? Or are there any leagues that offer scholarships or offer sponsorships for students to participate in? So very, very good things, very good analysis, very good things to think about in terms of how race and how class plays into how students can move forward, how they can participate. If it's a passion of theirs, are they really going to be able to get involved in that passion? Or are they going to have tons of money, and also along with that, parental or guardian support? So that was our reading for today. I hope that you got something out of it, and that you will join us tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care, and God bless. Again, this was our reading for today. I hope that you got something out of it. Take care, and God bless.